Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to day 2 of the One Ocean Hub seminar series on marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Yesterday, we covered some of the procedural aspects of the negotiations, and now today, we're going to be covering some of the more meatier topics of what that treaty is going to contain. So we've got 3 topics today for you, 3 speakers and 3 discussants. Okay, so we'll be covering first fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Second, we'll be covering the topic of adjacency. And then to finish, we'll be covering the topic of marine genetic resources. In terms of housekeeping and stuff like that, if you can please introduce yourself in the chat function, okay, where you're coming from, and your name as well. And then also please make use of the Q&A function as well. Okay, each speaker will have 15 minutes. Okay, we'll then have 5 minutes of discussion and questions from the discussant, and then the speaker will then have another 5 minutes for a sort of sur rebuttal. Okay, we'll then have 30 minutes at the end for sort of plenary Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, we have Professor Richard Barnes from the University of Lincoln, who will be talking us through fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And then our discussant will be Dr. Emmanuel Acheampong from the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. Okay, now the title of Richard's presentation is "What Will the BBNJ Mean for High Seas Fisheries?" So Richard, please, if you want to start screen sharing, you'll have the floor and 15 minutes to make your presentation.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen now. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here virtually and to be contributing to the work and the great work that the One Ocean Hub is doing. So as Mitchell suggested, I'm going to be looking at the impact of the BBNJ agreement on fisheries. My interest is in the international regulation of fisheries, and I've been banging the drum a little bit recently about why it's important to include fisheries within the BBNJ agreement. And so that's the kind of principal focus of my talk. But it's really in 3 main parts. First of all, I want to spend a bit of time looking at the reasons why it's important to include fisheries within the agreement. But obviously there is some resistance to that on the part of states. So I'll be looking then, secondly, at some of the reasons why states have objected to the inclusion of fisheries within the agreement. Now, regardless of whatever happens, I think that the agreement will influence or have some impact on fisheries management going forward. And so the main part, I think, of my talk is going to be looking at some of the ways in which we can either use the agreement to enhance or improve the governance of fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Going to start running through those, and I think throughout my talk, I think I've got sort of 2 principal points of focus in terms of the case for inclusion. And this is really to do with both the natural and legal requirements for integration and systemic coherence. The simple fact of the matter is that it will be impossible to properly govern areas beyond national jurisdiction without having some degree of reference to fishing activities, because they are the major adverse impact on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So we have to acknowledge that basic fact. And then secondly, I think, from a legal point of view, one of the things that we always stress is the idea of coherence in terms of rules. So we have an existing body of law of the sea, and so the new agreement will fit into that, and it will be impossible for it to ignore its potential systemic repercussions on other areas of the law of the sea. So I think the key point is to recognize and to stress that, and to kind of go with the flow, so to speak, in terms of building and supporting systemic coherence. So moving then to the sort of first substantive part of my talk, the case for inclusion of fisheries within the areas, the ABNJ agreement. The first point to stress here, I think, is that the inclusion or exclusion of fisheries is essentially a political issue. It's not really a legal issue. I can argue in favor of kind of systemic coherence, but ultimately, whether or not states decide to include or exclude fisheries from it, and the extent to which they do that, will be a political issue, and one which is motivated by their self-interest. So we have to be sensitive to that and not try and push for higher degrees of integration or inclusion than states may be willing to accept. That said, though, I think it's important that we do try and work constructively towards the inclusion of fisheries, because we are at what might be called a moment in time. In perhaps 100 years, we've had 4 opportunities to develop law of the sea, general lawmaking, law of the sea conventions. We had success in 1958 with the Geneva Convention, and 1982 with the Law of the Sea Convention. And if we don't take advantage of the current opportunity, then it could be decades before we have the chance to revisit this issue. And given there's an acceptance that fisheries management isn't entirely working at the moment, this would be very much a lost opportunity. More specifically, though, I think there are 4 reasons why we need to include fisheries within the BBNJ agreement. The first of these, I think, is self-obvious. It's accepted that fishing is the main threat, main adverse threat to biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. This was acknowledged when the BBNJ process was mandated, the acceptance that illegal fishing, overfishing, unregulated fishing were damaging marine biodiversity, and something which is widely recognized in the scientific literature. So if that's the case, then this is something that we need to accommodate within the agreement. Otherwise, we can't address those adverse impacts. The second issue is that we need to recognize that there are existing governance gaps within the management of fisheries, and so the ABNJ agreement provides an opportunity to address that. There are both governance gaps and substantive gaps, or what you might call geographic gaps. So, for example, we don't have RFMOs in certain areas of the world, Southwest Atlantic, Central Atlantic. We've also got gaps in species coverage. So, say, for example, some of the highly migratory fisheries bodies, tuna bodies, don't deal with non-tuna species. So apart from that, we also have governance gaps. And so the ABNJ agreement provides an opportunity to start addressing those by setting out governance principles which could potentially be integrated into existing fisheries management bodies. So this table here is really just a kind of quick overview of where some of these governance gaps may exist. So sort of 10 principles of good ocean governance are sort of pushed by people like David Freestone. And as you can see, where there are plus signs, we've got kind of references in the legal instruments to advancing those principles, but where there are question marks or gaps, we have a lack of reference to these substantive principles. And so the ABNJ agreement, by establishing principles and cooperative mechanisms, could potentially start to fill those governance gaps. The third area which supports the inclusion of fisheries is the idea of an integrated approach towards oceans governance, something which is set out in the preamble to the Law of the Sea Convention, which looks at treating the problems of oceans as a whole, and something which has been reiterated in the Fish Stocks Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and other soft law instruments. So if we don't integrate fisheries into the BBNJ agreement, then we've got the potential for increasing fragmentation and conflict. And then fourthly, we need to include fisheries. It's better to do this directly rather than indirectly. And this is because, regardless of whether fisheries are specifically mentioned, some of the mechanisms, for example, environmental impact assessment, or the development of area-based management tools which are proposed within the BBNJ agreement, will indirectly impact on fisheries, either through looking at cumulative impacts in terms of environmental impact assessment, or through the designation of certain areas of sea as being protected and subject to restrictions on activities. And so the likelihood is they will indirectly impact upon fisheries, and so it's better to be upfront about the inclusion of fisheries that way. Now, set against the inclusion of fisheries is the idea that because we've already got an existing body of international fisheries law and regional fisheries management organisations which are managing fisheries activities, then there's no reason why this new instrument should step on their toes and potentially conflict with these existing mandates. And this is something which has always been part of the BBNJ process. So when it was, again, initiated, it was stated quite clearly by the General Assembly that the process and its results should not undermine existing relevant legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional and sectoral bodies. So it shouldn't conflict with existing legal obligations, but perhaps more profoundly, it shouldn't conflict with the existing authority which those bodies enjoy. Now, despite this, the agreement which is being negotiated and developed doesn't specifically define what undermine means? And this has been something which has been very much open for debate within the literature. But I suggest there are potentially 4 things that this actually means in terms of practice. First of all, if the ABNJ agreement is not to undermine, this means that it shouldn't have any direct conflicts with existing rights and obligations of states. So if RFMOs have provisions or powers to do certain things, then new or conflicting provisions shouldn't be adopted within the BBNJ agreement. The second one is non-duplication. Even if there's not a direct conflict between them, there shouldn't be overlapping mandates, because this could allow potential conflicts or disputes to arise as to who would be properly authorised to conduct certain activities. Thirdly, what I would suggest is that whilst it shouldn't undermine potentially existing mandates, this doesn't rule out potentially enhancing existing mandates, giving RFMOs, for example, new powers or enabling them to act in new ways through, for example, cooperation. And I think this is potentially where the BBNJ agreement can offer the most in terms of fisheries regulation. And then finally, there's the idea of non-retrogression. It wouldn't undermine existing bodies if the BBNJ agreement sought to sort of accept and build upon some of the substantive standards which are already present within regional fisheries management bodies and so on. Now, that's the case for and the case against. And I think in practice, what we're going to see here is not a kind of stark black and white move one way or the other way, that there will be kind of some degree of mediation between these 2 extremes. And so what I've focused on here are the potential for the new provisions of the BBNJ agreement to try and enhance or build upon these existing approaches within RFMOs, and to try and enhance cooperation, to try and reduce potentials for conflict between the BBNJ agreements and existing bodies. And if it can do that, then that's got the potential to at least indirectly improve the management of fisheries. So we've got potentially these different options then for improving fisheries governance. First of all, within the BBNJ agreement, and I'll run through 3 areas where I think that's possible, but in a worst case scenario, there still remain possibilities for institutional development outside of the ABNJ agreement. And this is really kind of building upon the status quo, as it were. So moving then to the first of the opportunities to enhance the regulation of fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the first argument here is that if the new agreement can set forth general principles with general application to areas beyond national jurisdiction, then these can have a normative influence or impact upon the conduct of existing sets of activities. So in the way that they can perhaps influence the development of standards within existing sectoral and regional bodies, but perhaps more specifically require states to take into account these principles when they conduct themselves either unilaterally or within these fora. And to an extent, this has been accepted within the BBNJ agreement. So draft Article 5, as it stands here at the moment, lists a series of 7 general principles which have general application. You'll notice, and I think you've probably already talked through this, that the text at the moment isn't quite set in stone. So where there appear these square brackets, then these are points where there is not yet general agreement on whether or not to include this particular provision here. So you'll see, for example, in terms of Article 5, even the title principles is something contentious, but actually some of the substantive principles like accountability, non-retrogression, and so on, are still up for debate here. But potentially these can have an influence in terms of the practice of existing bodies here. So the second way forward, and I think this is potentially more important here, is to improve the cooperative mechanism. Sorry, I've got a sensitive trigger finger here, it keeps on moving backwards and forwards between the slides, so apologies there. The second option here is to create or establish or potentially enhance opportunities for cooperation within the scope of the BBNJ agreements. And by enhancing cooperation, this can allow for the diffusion of norms, building up of shared understandings, but also the development potentially of shared practices between or within different institutional settings. The question, though, is the extent to which these will be effective, but also perhaps go beyond what we might call mere obligations of cooperation. So just by way of kind of starting point, there's a little grid here of the diagram on the right of the screens. And this kind of maps out the extent to which there are different opportunities for institutional cooperation within the new agreement. So that the pink box there is the idea of a single authority which has plenary responsibilities and basically drives cooperation and lawmaking in all sectors. Perhaps something that's not on the cards at the moment and is unlikely to be accepted by states in the near, if not distant future. The second option is the idea in yellow, in the box in yellow there, of kind of composite regional organisations. The idea that we combine RFMOs with, for example, regional seas arrangements, and they kind of then work together to develop coherent, compatible mandates for addressing fisheries and environmental issues. Again, something which represents kind of a strong integration, but is unlikely to be accepted by states. The blue option is a bit more like the status quo at the moment, where we have a series of kind of largely non-binding recommendations and guidelines being pushed through the UN General Assembly, but then are left to individual states and organisations to pick up themselves. And what appears to be being pushed by the new BBNJ agreement here is the idea of coordinated sectoral management, an enhanced status quo, where, for example, there is institutional mandates to cooperate across sectors, but allowing these kind of regional arrangements to kind of design mechanisms to suit particular regional needs. Now, how will this work within the new agreement? Well, I think the key thing here is for us to look for what you might call value added or kind of stronger or more institutionalized provisions for cooperation. The Law of the Sea Convention is replete with obligations to cooperate, in respect of straddling stocks, shared stocks, conservation and management on the high seas, environmental protection. But it really is kind of exhorting general cooperation rather than mandating specific forms and forums for cooperation. And it's only really if we can start to structure and improve this that we'll start to see perhaps improvements in the management of fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Unfortunately, the provisions on this at the moment are a bit of a mixed bag within the ABNJ agreement. So, for example, if we look at Article 6, it tends to replicate the kind of existing exhortations on states to cooperate, but doesn't structure this in particular ways. But when we start to look perhaps at more specific activities, we can see a little bit more detail emerging in areas where there are going to be kind of stronger mechanisms for cooperation. So, for example, within Articles 14 and 15, which deal with area-based management tools, the emphasis there is very much on making sure that whatever tool that is adopted is done so in a holistic and inclusive manner. So that requirement there to design tools which are very much more inclusive is a perhaps stronger degree of cooperation, as it were, than we already see. Similarly, under Article 25, which talks about environmental impact assessment, it requires cumulative impacts to be taken into account by states when they're designing their impact assessment mechanisms. And so cumulative impacts will take into account not just new activities, but the impact of these activities on other ongoing activities, which would necessarily include fisheries. The question is then how that kind of balance and account is taken forward in practice. But of all the provisions, I think perhaps one of the potentially most enticing or interesting is the one which is provided for in terms of the Conference of Parties. So it's generally accepted that there will be a conference of parties within the new agreement, and one of its responsibilities will be to promote cooperation and coordination amongst existing legal mechanisms. And so if we have a body which is charged with this cooperation and coordination, this can then start to bring forward and kind of force, almost without intruding upon existing mandates, this idea of integrated thinking. And in particular, one of its responsibilities will be to establish processes for cooperation and coordination. And if we have an ABNJ Conference of Parties, which is going to set out these new mechanisms for cooperation and coordination, then again, this structure, as it were, for integrating different sectoral approaches could potentially move forward in a much more constructive manner. Moving then on to the third of the potential mechanisms here. This is more, I guess, a savings clause here. We've got to balance, as it were, the kind of tension between inclusion and exclusion of fisheries to balance the kind of tensions between states. And one way of doing this is through kind of traditional lawmaking approaches common to other treaties, where we basically define the relationship between a new treaty and existing or future agreements. This is typically done through conflicts and compatibility clauses. We have some of these provisions within the draft BBNJ agreement. So Article 4 defines its relationship with existing instruments, although this builds in the idea of not undermining. But we've also got potentially its relationship to other agreements, and Article 64 here allows state parties potentially to, in the future, if we get that far, to adapt and modify their agreements inter se. So there is some degree of flexibility built in there. So just to kind of summarize these, though, the main elements of the ABNJ conflicts clause is not to be prejudicial to the law of the sea convention, to respect coastal state jurisdiction, which I think Clive will talk about in more detail soon. It should be interpreted in a way which doesn't undermine existing bodies. And that's quite an interesting one because it talks about interpretation or application. And that does allow a little bit of room for maneuver in terms of mediating potential conflicts between instruments. It shouldn't have an effect on non-parties, and it permits the inter se modification. Where I think it's lacking, though, is that it kind of restricts kind of interference, as it were, but what it doesn't do so far is to really drive forward constructive and positive engagements. And so, for example, require a compatible approach with other agreements. And just by way of contrast, we've got Article 7 of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which is a kind of template here, which requires conservation and management areas on the high seas to be adopted in a way which is compatible with those in areas of national jurisdiction. It doesn't structure or prioritize them, but what it does is it requires them to be compatible. And so that positive obligation to engage and work through what compatibility means is a way of potentially building in a mechanism for future change and developments. I think this is something which is maybe a lost opportunity in the BBNJ agreement as it stands, in terms of pushing forward constructive approaches. So anyway, coming on to my final slide, this is, well, what happens if the BBNJ agreement ignores fisheries, it doesn't take forward some of these constructive cooperative mechanisms, then where are we left standing? And I think it's important to bear in mind that fisheries regulation will continue regardless of what the content of the BBNJ agreement is through existing mechanisms and processes. Now, whether or not it will do so effectively and potentially rectify some of the existing failings is another question. So I think there are potentially here two main mechanisms where this will continue to happen. The first of these is for the UN General Assembly to have a continued role in developing and coordinating activities. And it has done this to an extent successfully in the past through, for example, promoting the drift net fishing ban, but also provoking the development of guidelines on bottom fishing and protection of vulnerable marine ecosystems. Now, these have become kind of mainstays of potentially the governance of high seas areas. And so there is this potential for these kind of activities to continue to develop. One of the challenges is, however, is that the General Assembly is not really a forum best suited to governing fisheries. It's plenary, it doesn't have the time and capacity to do this. But also it's been accused of perhaps being a bit of a pulpit for kind of like trying to push forward agendas which are maybe not acceptable to all states. And so we can get very much caught up in the kind of political machinations of that, which is not what we want when we're looking at the detail of fisheries management and operative solutions. The second option then is just to leave things to happen on an ad hoc basis and see, for example, improved collaborations between existing sectoral bodies. And so we do have some examples of good practice. So we've got an MOU between NIAFC and OSPAR, regional fisheries and environmental organisations in the Northeast Atlantic, where they started to build up participatory processes and observer processes and exchanges of information to try and better integrate what would be kind of good governance and environmental principles into fisheries management. But obviously this happens on an ad hoc basis. And what we're really looking for from the BBNJ agreement is something which is going to kind of structure and force these types of interactions to happen, not just in limited areas, but across the board and in a way which is kind of transparent, accountable, and which can contribute towards perhaps improved and measurably improved outcomes for fisheries management. But again, that's something, I guess, for the future and something we can discuss in questions. So I'll thank you for your time and attention, and hopefully we'll have some interesting questions afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Richard. Yeah, I certainly agree that, we don't want this opportunity to kind of slip through the international community's fingers. So yeah, without further ado, I am going to give the floor to Emmanuel for 5 minutes to make some comments and questions to Richard. Okay, and then after that, you'll have 5 minutes to respond, Richard. Okay. So Emmanuel, you have the floor.
Wow. Thank you very much, Richard, for the nice presentation and for educating us today on ABNJ agreement. You touched on so many things, and I'm grateful for that. My major concern is on the establishment of MPAs as a tool for ensuring sustainable fisheries conservation and use. Because currently, we all agree that the most successful tool available for ensuring that the fishery resources of our continental shelves are sustainably managed are through the MPAs. And what we know now is that they are currently established through regional fisheries agreements. So agreements that are done between, like you mentioned, the OSPA agreements, okay, that ensure that some MPA is established, but we have far and few. So do you think that we can catch into the new ABN agreement a procedure that will allow us to have a mechanism for establishing MPAs across different sections of our high seas that also gets the contribution of the countries that are bordering these regions? Because currently, the UNCLOS does not demand that. It only encourages national countries to contribute towards the management of the high seas. It doesn't demand that. So it means that we need a new framework to ensure that countries bordering the different regions of our seas have a stake and are contributing towards the management of the MPAs that may be established in their areas. I don't know what your thought on this is.
Oh, Richard, your mic is muted.
Shall I come back in here, Emmanuel? Yeah.
Yes, please, Richard.
Okay. I mean, I think that the issue of marine protected areas is absolutely critical. So just by way of context, one of the kind of challenges from a legal point of view is the authority to establish them, but to make them binding against other states here. So within areas beyond national jurisdiction, nobody has exclusive authority to designate territory use in a particular way. The kind of mechanism we have at the moment is flag state jurisdiction. And with flag state jurisdiction, you do it bit by bit, and only when every state in the world effectively has agreed to regulate its vessels to respect MPAs would you get a kind of successful outcome. So the question here is there a kind of process which would allow us to designate MPAs on the high seas in an inclusive manner, but which can then have kind of what you might call real world or third party effects? Because if we don't, then those MPAs are not going to work. So that's the kind of basic challenge here, and creating a mechanism within the BBNJ to achieve that. Now, this is something which hasn't been reconciled here, I guess, because at the moment, whilst we might want to designate MPAs, they haven't yet really been designated effectively on the high seas. We've had sort of some of the regional seas agreements like OSPA have kind of touched upon high seas areas. Again, within CAMLO, you've got areas of that. But there isn't a kind of systematic process for achieving this. And in the absence of a kind of systematic process, which is inclusive, which takes into account the different interests, you're always going to have disputes about the kind of outcomes. So it's really getting that kind of process nailed down, I think, Emmanuel.
Yeah, but my concern is until that it is done, for most countries, especially in the developing world, the management of the high seas will be useless to them, because for them, what is most important is fish. So if we don't have a system that can protect the fish and make it available for generations to come, then they will not be able to buy into whatever agreement that is put forward. My last comment before probably I step down for others to ask their question is how we can incorporate local traditions and customs into this agreement. You did not touch on that your presentation. Do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I've written elsewhere on the importance of looking at food security and artisanal fisheries. And I think there's a really important set of values there that need to be captured, that kind of respect for those traditions and knowledges. And to an extent, they're included in things like the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, but it's a non-binding agreement. So I think there is potentially scope for that. I guess the kind of challenges are that most states don't really have traditional fisheries on the high seas, as far as I'm aware. They mostly tend to be restricted to coastal waters there. That's not to say they shouldn't, but it means that you've probably got fewer precedents for that. But I think the only way that this could really be advanced is, for example, the general principles within the BBNJ agreement to touch upon those kind of, ideas of traditional knowledge and local needs as part of the kind of decision-making process, or the kind of factors to be accounted for.
Yeah, I think the benefits here will be more towards the species that are a bit more migratory. So spending time in local sea areas, whilst migrating also to high seas for feeding and for reproductive purposes. So then when we're able to capture local traditions into these management procedures, then at least when they are onshore, okay, they will be protected and be used sustainably. Okay, so I think, thank you very, very much, Richard. That was a nice presentation. I'll step down, Michelle, for others to ask questions.
Awesome, thank you very much. So yeah, just a gentle reminder to our audience, please make use of the Q&A function and we'll save the questions for the plenary at the end. Okay, so moving on to our second presentation of the afternoon, we have Professor Clive Schofield from the World's Maritime University, who is presenting on adjacency and conservation in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Okay, and then acting as discussant, we have my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Alana Lancaster from the University of West Indies at Cave Hill in Barbados. Okay, so Clive, you have the floor and 15 minutes.
Apologies for slight electronic issues. I do not, as I joked before the session, I do not have a PhD in Zoom, although I do feel most of us are on the way to that. And I'll try and share. Do you have full screen?
All clear.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Mitchell, whilst I'm sorting myself out, did you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, well, I did. Yeah, I forgot that at the beginning. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Mitchell Lennon. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. I'm also affiliated with the One Ocean Hub, and yeah, I'm acting as a moderator today. Super excellent timing. Thank you for that opportunity, Clive. Cheers.
No worries at all.
Right, I'll give you the floor.
How to moderate the moderator? It's great.
Oh yeah.
Do you have full screen now, gentlemen?
Yeah, we do. So I'll give you 15 minutes starting from now. Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, first I need to get my excuses in early. I've ensured that I'm not first author on this presentation, which I'm presenting. It really is this paper, this discussion is the contours, if you will, of a paper that Joanna Mossop and I have published in Marine Policy. Unfortunately, Joanna is really the one who should be presenting. However, I failed to persuade her to get out of bed at 1 a.m. in New Zealand to join us today. So I will say, well, I'll present on behalf of the two of us, but I myself am it's not an excuse as such, but it is an admission that I'm a geographer by training, and B, I'm not necessarily a disciple of the BBNJ, but I am very interested in the spatial complexities associated with the issues that we're looking at. And hopefully I'll be able to explain or touch on some of the spatial complexities as well as the functional issues at stake. So I'll hopefully provide some graphic illustration of some of the spatial complexities to touch on the idea, the word adjacency that has been proposed in some quarters, policy brief in particular, as a way to deal with interactions across and between zones, particularly where we have ecosystems that are connected to one another across those limits and boundaries. The issue, or the real challenge of connectivity between ecosystems and organisms across broad areas spatially, the possibility of due regard as a way of dealing with the interaction of those zones, but also the rights and obligations across them. So, first funky graphic, and again, I have to put in a caveat, it's not really mine. My former PhD student, Dr. Andy Arsana, is the author of the graphic, but I think it gives a nice way to visualize that layering of rights and obligations between different zones, and particularly the extended continental shelf underlying areas of the high seas and bordering onto the international seabed area. And I really have to change the timing on that slide to give myself enough time to yarn about it. One of the key uncertainties, is we don't fully know the spatial extent of ABNJ, of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Partially that's because many states simply make ambit claims to their maritime zones and don't necessarily deposit precise limits to their claims with the UN Secretary General by way of the Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea. How do we deal with excessive claims? Certainly there are a large number of states around the world, over half the globe's coastal states, have some form of straight baseline claim, and many of those claims are, I won't even say really, arguably are excessive in character. Also, subsequent to the arbitration between the Philippines and China, we now have a much more detailed understanding of Article 121, and particularly Article 121.3, in terms of the classification of features between a fully entitled feature under Article 121 and a mere rock under Article 121.3. Of course, bear in mind that that particular case was only directly binding on its parties, but nonetheless, it's, in my view, potentially influential, as it is the only international judicial decision that directly deals with interpretation of the regime of islands. What is remarkable about that ruling is that it's so at odds with state practice. States have a tendency, perhaps unsurprisingly, to try and maximize their claims and assert broad jurisdictional claims from even the tiniest of features. Probably the paradigm case of a rock under, and I'm going off on a slight tangent here, is Rockall off the northwest of Scotland, but it is one of the very, very few examples of, I think it's the unique example of a state, United Kingdom, having asserted 200 nautical mile breadth rights from it, having rolled that claim back just prior to acceding to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, on the basis that this was a feature that fits within the definition of an Article 121.3 rock. There are also uncertainties where we have multiple claims to the same maritime space, and therefore that can impact on the limits of ABNJ. Now, where we have overlapping claims to maritime space, generally you would see a process that eventually will lead to the division of the overlap through delimitation of a maritime boundary. We are just a little bit over 50% of potential maritime boundaries globally actually having some form of agreement associated with them, and many of those agreements are themselves incomplete, either in with regard to the length of the lines involved or with respect to the maritime zones involved. So many of the early agreements predate the advent of the convention itself and the general acceptance of the 200 nautical mile limited exclusive economic zone. So early agreements, for example, in North Sea are associated with continental shelf, but not water column. Now I have a graphic up there of a very small postage size graphic of the South China Sea, but the Southwest and South China Sea is a classic example of this. Indonesia has agreed seabed boundaries with both Malaysia and Vietnam, but the water column boundary is not agreed, and Indonesia's national mapping, its official maps issued every year, illustrate its forward position, which is substantially seaward of its agreed seabed boundaries. So even where we can tick off those boundaries as having some agreement associated with them, it by no means means that we haven't got disputes to deal with. The other issue, of course, that impacts on the extent of the areas beyond national jurisdiction is the issue of changing coastlines, particularly in the context of global mean sea level rise. And again, in terms of caveats, we need to be very careful about making sweeping claims about the impacts of sea level rise on coastlines because of the complex interactions and feedbacks between the morphology or shape of the coastline in response to changing sea level, and equally the responses of coastal ecosystems such as corals and mangroves, which have been noted have the ability to autonomously adapt to vertically in terms of responses to changing sea level. Nonetheless, as a generality, again, states tend to maximize their claims to maritime jurisdiction through the so-called envelope of arcs, means of defining or delineating the outer limits to maritime claims. And this could be illustrative of a 12 nautical mile limited territorial sea or a 200 nautical mile limited exclusive economic zone. And through natural processes, one may, as a state, get lucky, as it were, and you will see depositional processes along the coast. Tectonic uplift processes can produce the same sort of result. Gradually over time, isostatic rebound will see certain coastlines raising at a higher rate than sea level rise, and therefore more land is revealed, the baselines are advanced seaward, and therefore as a consequence of that, there will be a redefinition of the outer limits of maritime claims, an expansion of claims within national jurisdiction, and a contraction of areas beyond national jurisdiction. But in the context of sea level rise, on a global level, we may well see an accelerating sea level rise at an unprecedented rate, according to the IPCC Ocean and Cryosphere special report last year. You would anticipate a retraction of normal baselines unless they are fixed by a legal purpose, and that's a whole different workshop. And as a consequence of that, a potential retraction in national maritime claims and an expansion of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So much of, I would say as an aside, there's much of the narrative around sea level rise and impacts on maritime baselines, limits and boundaries is driven by small island states where this is absolutely an existential threat. You could argue there's also a public interest or global public interest argument around the expansion of areas beyond national jurisdiction as part of the global commons in favor of those ambulatory baselines, that being the case, rather than attempts to fix them. Different arguments to discuss. The other issue of uncertainty, which is a large one, is one that I think the drafters of the convention didn't anticipate to be such a big deal. There are a couple of reasons for thinking that. The records suggest, in terms of the drafting of Article 76 of the convention, that it was anticipated that between 25 and 30 states, the margineers, those states that are sitting on top of broad continental margins, only they would be in a position to define outer limits to the continental shelf exceeding 200 nautical miles from baselines. In reality, we have, think of the order of 83 states and potentially up to 85 states involved. And when you have only 152 coastal states to play with, that means over half of the coastal states around the planet have or could make a submission to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf for areas of continental shelf seaward of that 200-mile limit. Now, the other reason I think that it was not anticipated to be a big deal is that the CLCS, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, is the one body created through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that essentially is unfunded. It's unlike ITLOS, unlike the ISA, we have a body of scientific and technical experts to consider the submissions of states related to extended continental shelf claims. And oddly enough, these are scientists. They treat the submissions with scientific rigor. And as a consequence of that, it's taking of the order of 2 years to consider each submission. Now, even broken into the subcommissions, 3 subcommissions, you're still getting through only a very limited number of the 100 submissions plus that now sit before the CLCS. 33, I think the last count that I did, 33 actual sets of recommendations have been rendered. So we have probably, this would be the best job in the law of the sea, because you're looking at 30 to 40 years worth of work, except it's the one part of the law of the sea that is unfunded. Pros and cons. Nevertheless, the upshot of this is that of the order of 37 million square kilometers of continental shelf seaward of 200 nautical mile limits is subject to submissions. But we're nowhere near the end of the process for delineating those outer limits on the basis of recommendations of the CLCS. Plus, of the order of 3.3 million square kilometers of that 37 million is subject to competing submissions. And the CLCS doesn't have the mandate to resolve those disputes between coastal states. It's a body of scientific and technical advice. It provides recommendations. It overtly is not going to deal with maritime delimitation issues. So we have uncertainty as a consequence of that over the extent of the ABNJ. Turning to the adjacency issues, one of the ways in which adjacency has been advocated is to take into account the fact that coastal states, I think quite rightly, have concerns over potential activities or indeed conservation measures that might, if you will, border their own areas within national jurisdiction. So this is a geographical understanding of the term adjacency. And I think it's fair to say that even though adjacency itself as a word doesn't appear in the convention, adjacent does on multiple occasions. And usually it refers, for example, in maritime delimitation terms, to adjacent states. It's the dictionary understanding of adjacent as being proximate or next to. The difficulty is adjacency concepts don't deal very well with the reality of ecological or indeed cultural connectivity or interests. And that's where I think the term adjacency leads us down a geographic, it pains me to say it as a geographer, but it pains me, it suggests geographical adjacency or proximity, and that's inappropriate in the context of ecological connectivity. It should be noted that in the geographical sense, that the word adjacent does occur in the convention, it occurs in the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, And when you look at the draft text themselves for the ILBI, again, I would think it's fair to say that it's meant in a spatial sense, in a geographical sense. And that doesn't deal well with the connectivity issue, which I'll illustrate with pretty pictures. And when we're talking about connectivity, essentially this is to encapsulate both activities and, in an ecological sense, the interconnectivities across space. And what you find in terms of horizontal connectivity, this is what covers migratory stocks. So you have active connectivity, illustrating in the Pacific here, how tuna and tuna-like species span the entire ocean basin in terms of their range. But there's also passive connectivity. For example, when fish species at a juvenile stage, they will be spread across the ocean by way of the circulatory system of currents. Similarly, on a horizontal basis, or vertical basis, we have multiple species which, while they spend significant portions of their adult life connected to the sea floor, and therefore would fit the definition of sedentary species, which we'll come to in a moment, in their juvenile or larval stages, they'll be in the water column. So we have, particularly if we look at areas of extended shelf where you have sovereign rights belonging to the coastal state overlaid by areas of high seas, part of the global commons, then you have species that at one stage of their development are under coastal state jurisdiction, and at other stages of their life cycles will be part of ABNJ. So there's that level of complexity to deal with. How do we manage it? Well, I mentioned sedentary species. I'll show you, hopefully, if the internet cooperates and I can master PowerPoint to that extent, some of the headaches that can apply here. Sedentary species in particular, organisms that at their harvestable stage, of course, there's scope for interpretation as what the harvestable stage will be when we're talking about marine genetic resources, either immobile or on or under the seabed, unable to move except through constant physical contact with seabed and subsoil. You might think that's a lobster. Lobsters occasionally swim. This is a problem. So how do you handle species that are sedentary as adults but not at the juvenile stage? How do you deal with that layering of zones and therefore rights and responsibilities? I can see a great flow of academic legal articles on this, but I can only foresee headaches for marine scientists in trying to disentangle who has rights and responsibilities and jurisdiction over what species and when, particularly when the marine scientists in question know very little potentially about the species in question until they actually find them and capture them and identify them. So that requires definitions and it requires consultation. Now, this is where I hope to get my master's at least in Zoom and indeed PowerPoint. And if I can get this to go, this is an illustration of what I would instinctively think is a sedentary species. It's a scallop. Now, there are bilateral disputes have occurred, particularly the one I'm thinking of between Canada and the United States of America over this definition, over this feature, this species, which, as you can see, is sedentary, and then it's not. So we have if you're American, at one stage of discussions at least, this is a fish. Okay, I exaggerate slightly, but the American argument to the Canadians in terms of their dispute over scallops were existing on what Canada regards as part of its extended continental shelf is that this doesn't count as a sedentary species because of what we just seen. But this is illustrative of the kind of complexity that needs to be dealt with under the ILBI. Now, in terms of some of the options for dealing with this complexity, well, when there's no recommendation on the delineation of the outer limits of a particular extended continental shelf submission by the CLCS, one way to deal with that is, in a precautionary way, is to treat that submitted area as part of national jurisdiction until such time as the outer limit is delineated on a final and binding way under Article 76. One could request an agreement between the coastal states concerned. I'm doubtful whether that would be swift in coming in all cases. Where you have those disputes, you could assume that both coastal states are actually the coastal state for the purposes of the ILBI. That's likely to complicate things with respect to the establishment of MPAs and conduct of EIAs. And you could go down a trust arrangement agreement to try and deal with any revenues arising from MGRs. I'm going to wind up because I think my 15 minutes is likely up. But from a coastal state perspective, there's a need to protect existing rights. There would be if I was a coastal state, I'm not directly involved in negotiations, I'd want to at least ensure that there's a mechanism for consultation in relation to activities or conservation arrangements in those areas adjacent or proximate to my own areas within maritime jurisdiction. And I'd want to be able to have a mechanism whereby I could propose conservation mechanisms where I'm trying to protect a particular ecosystem which straddles the limits of national jurisdiction and ABNJ. And I want legal certainty over how that process takes place. I think adjacency is, well, it's probably the wrong phrase to use, but a red herring. It gives a misleading idea of geographical adjacency when we need to recognize that the states on the other side of the ocean basin may have a legitimate interests and connectivity to the ecosystems in question. I think we need compatibility between area-based management tools within and beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. And in this, I think the coordination and cooperation is key. And I think what Richard just mentioned in terms of the conference of parties is the obvious medium or body that might be able to initiate that coordination and cooperation and facilitate it. I think proximate coastal states are right to be concerned over what takes place beyond their immediate national jurisdiction. I think I've made the point about non-proximate states. I think from an external perspective, it appears unlikely that the proximate geographically adjacent states will be afforded additional rights beyond their national jurisdiction. But there are still significant spatial and functional complexities to deal with. And I think, in a way, the debate on ABNJ has focused on activities and conservation measures within ABNJ. But there's also needs to be, I think, more recognition of the way in which those ecosystems don't neatly fit within areas beyond national jurisdiction, but straddle those limits of national jurisdiction and boundaries between them. So the object of the paper with Joanna, and in my final comment, I'd say the tricky legal questions you're about to ask me really go to on a postcard to Wellington, but really due regard as an organizing general principle as an alternative to adjacency. And I thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Clive. I really enjoyed that, especially kind of addressing the issues both in the kind of legal and scientific camp. Now, time is marching on a wee bit. So, Alana, can I kindly ask you to just ask maybe 1 or 2 questions to Clive, and then we will move on to the third presentation. Thanks.
Alana, that's clearly a question for Joanna. Oh, sorry, I said that a bit
early. Thank you for your presentation, and I have to say the illustrations really brought back memories from my undergrad days when I was a geography minor. So yes, one of my key questions I suspect will go to Joanna, because I wanted to ask with respect to the concept of due regard, whether there was need to, because you give illustrations in your article as in respect to how due regard can give a more realistic or a more acceptable formula in which states are likely to address the realities of the interconnectivity and the adjacency of the marine environment. But perhaps what I can focus on, and maybe by way of comment, and then asking you your thoughts. One of the areas that it strikes me that is not under the scope of the BBNJ negotiations, but are likely to filter into the success should the instrument come into force, is that of delimitation. And you indicated this in terms of the protracted outer continental shelf delimitations, and certainly in my region, not only are substantive delimitation an issue, the Caribbean is largely delimited, and when it is either by treaty, but it has often been by contentious means. But there also the fact that several states are also claiming continental, extended continental shelves. Do you have any thoughts on whether these considerations should straddle the discourse of the international legally binding instrument, or perhaps this is a conversation that should be held concurrently, in terms of whether the current system is adequate, or if whether changes can be made. Sorry, I'll stop there.
Just a quick response.
Thank you, Alana. In an ideal world, I would agree with you. And in a sense, maritime delimitation issues and delineation issues in terms of the outer limits of the extended shelf are ongoing. They're not quite, I would say, running in parallel, but they are continuing over time. I mean, if you've experienced carrying what I regard as the big red books home from the library, as the International Maritime Boundaries series now with its 9th volume about to come out, that's excellent exercise, because they are really, really heavy books, and they only deal with the agreements, and we're only just over halfway there. So there has been, the first 2 volumes of that series came out in 1993. So with the substantial progress in terms of maritime delimitation over time, and I always say to the students I have here, look, open an atlas. You've got a pretty familiar network of red lines. They're all on land. The map makers generally tend to fight shy of putting anything on the nice, lovely blue bit of the oceans, because there's a high degree of complexity of different types of line, and there's a lack of completeness, and a high degree of, guess what? If you've got a proliferation of potential maritime boundaries through the extension of maritime claims offshore, surprise, surprise, there's a proliferation of disputes. The states I'll give you one anecdotal side comment, which connects to your dealing with maritime delimitation through judicial means, solving adversarial claims. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire had a gentleman's agreement with where the maritime boundary was, right up until Ghana discovered 6 billion barrels of oil on their side of the equidistance line. Then you have a dispute. Resource driven,
Exactly.
and self-interest driven. So to answer your question, possibly, I don't think they could be directly connected in terms of, states are jealous about their rights. I think the base position of most states is to preserve the rights that they already possess. And we're dealing here, okay, not with sovereignty as such, but with sovereign rights of a coastal state. Handing that over to anybody else is very difficult. That's why, even though we have a succession of judicial cases on international maritime boundary delimitation, it's still only about 25 cases. Yeah. And that's a small fragment of the agreements on maritime boundaries, because the vast majority are the result of negotiations, and in one case only, two cases really, as a result of a facilitated negotiation in the form of a conciliation. Yeah. Between Iceland, Norway, and Australia and Timor-Leste. Yeah. Which is a really interesting new way to resolve disputes rather than having to go to court.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. So just in the interest of time, we have some questions from the audience, and there is one that is directed to all panelists. Richard, I see you've already answered this in the chat, so I'll direct this at the rest of you who haven't had the chance to yet. And this comes from our PI at the One Ocean Hub, Elisa Morgera. And so the question is, what do you think is the most important contribution that academic researchers can make to the BBNJ negotiations on the topic of your presentation? So if you want to answer that for me, that would be great.
You're really forcing me to ring up New Zealand to get a response, and I'm not sure Joanna's going to be happy about that. Academics, we at least have an illusion that our writings are read by more than 3 people. I think what academics do have, maybe not an influencing, as an aside, we increasingly in academia are asked to trace our impact as well as our output. And it is often extremely hard to do that. And not least because politicians occasionally like to take credit for anything they do, even if it is directly traced from academic research. But what academics can do is tease out hard questions and tease out a suite of options for discussion. And in particular, in the area which I was looking at, particularly the spatial issues and adjacency, they can, as we've illustrated, indicate where and narrow the issues of where the problems are that need to be addressed. Difficulty we have as academics is that, particularly in the context of the BBNJ negotiations, is we only have a limited amount of text to work with, which is full of brackets and options. And then, therefore, we contend with being speculative and overly speculative, but necessarily speculative about the potential outcome. So the best academics make you think. Ideally, we raise the problems, and beyond that, a suite of potential solutions, ideally.
Excellent.
And I'm being too idealistic.
No, I don't know. I don't think so at all. You're making people think it's probably key and having some sort of impact. Unfortunately, due to kind of time constraints, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap up. I wish this could last much longer. So first of all, I know there's quite a few unanswered questions in the Q&A box. We'll see about answering those and putting the answers up on our YouTube channel along with the recording of this webinar. First of all, if I can just give a virtual hand to our panelists, our discussants, and then of course Senia working in the background as well, making sure everything goes really smoothly. So this is now coming to a close, but don't forget to tune in tomorrow, same virtual place, and then at 12 o'clock University Control Time, where we'll be covering area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and technology transfer as well. So hopefully you'll have time to join us for that. So again, another great thank you to all our contributors and panelists, etc. And yeah, that's us for the day. Thank you very much.